Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards is a 2.5D platform-style game for the Nintendo 64. The game was developed by HAL Laboratory and released after about a 3-year development cycle in the year 2000 in Japan and North America. It took about another year, but Kirby 64 did eventually come to Europe as well. The game was originally intended for release on the 64DD disk drive peripheral for the Nintendo 64, but was moved to a traditional cartridge following the commercial failure of the DD. Kirby 64 released fairly late into the Nintendo 64's life cycle, seeing as the GameCube was scheduled to release the following year, but it did still manage to sell a respectable amount of copies, 1.77 million to be exact. That puts Kirby 64 at 29th in terms of best-selling Nintendo 64 games, making it the first game from the Kirby series to break into a console's top 30, at least to my knowledge. Like some of the other N64 games I've talked about on my channel, Kirby 64 is a game I played as a kid and have some great memories of. But sadly, I never physically owned the game. We only ever rented it from Blockbuster if my memory serves me correctly. So up until now, I haven't really had a chance to go back and play Kirby 64 from start to finish as an adult. But thanks to my YouTube channel, I had the perfect excuse to pick it up again and give it a real thorough playthrough. As some of you might have guessed, I chose to play the Japanese version of Kirby 64 this time around, but the differences between this and the Western versions are extremely minimal. The biggest change I can think of is probably the title change. In Japan, the game is known as Hoshino Kirby 64 or Kirby of the Stars 64, while in the West it's of course known as Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards. The Japanese release follows their Kirby game naming scheme, while the Western game chose to add a subtitle to Kirby 64. It's not a huge change, but that's honestly the biggest difference you'll see between the two games. Kirby 64 was directed by Shimamura Shinichi, who took over the mainline Kirby franchise from series creator Sakurai Masahiro, starting back from Dreamland 2 on the Game Boy. The 3 purely original mainline Kirby games directed by Shimamura, Dreamland 2, Dreamland 3, and Kirby 64, are known as the Dark Matter Trilogy by fans because of their very similar main antagonists. Kirby 64 was the last original game Shimamura directed from the Kirby franchise, if we don't count the remake of Kirby's Adventure, known as Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland, which released on the Game Boy Advance in the year 2002. But now that we have a decent understanding of the background of Kirby 64, I think it's time we dive into the review. The first thing we see when we boot up the game, except for the company logos of course, is a short cinematic that essentially serves as a prelude of sorts to the main Kirby 64 game. In this cinematic, we see a heart-shaped planet that is home to a race of people who resemble fairies, come under attack by an enormous dark shadow-like entity. The fairies scramble to save a large crystal from falling into the shadow's clutches by sending it and a single fairy named Ribbon into space. But as she flees with the crystal, it is shattered by minions of the Dark Shadow. These shards are spread throughout the galaxy, some landing on Popstar along with Ribbon. Popstar is of course the home of Kirby, and as luck would have it, Ribbon finds herself face to face with the pink hero after she lands. Kirby tells Ribbon to leave the crystal shard collecting to him, and the two set off to do just that, as well as defeat the darkness that has taken over Ribbon's homeworld. Like every other cutscene you'll encounter throughout the game, there are no words here, only actions. But even without any verbal or textual interaction, I think this cutscene does a great job of concisely conveying the important information needed by the player to understand why we're doing what we're doing in Kirby 64. But not only does it convey that information, it does so in a way that is very charming and in the spirit of a Kirby game. The same can be said for pretty much every other cinematic in the game as well. Based on the fact that this is an N64 game, you might assume that there really wouldn't be all that many cutscenes, but Kirby 64 actually has a fair share of them. They are all rather short in-engine cinematics, but personally I was always looking forward to seeing the next one as I played through the game. They were all so much fun and full of that classic Kirby charm. So much so that I'd even say they were a highlight of the game for me personally. It's not often that I find myself chuckling at a game, especially one with no dialogue, but I'd be lying if I said Kirby 64 didn't have me going with almost every cutscene. My favorite is probably the one at the end of Neostar where Kirby and the gang are fleeing from a volcanic eruption, and Kirby has to suck up Waddle Dee to save him. It's little things like that that always put a smile on my face while I was playing through Kirby 64. Speaking of the Kirby gang, there are a total of 3 residents of Popstar that will help Kirby on his journey to collect the Crystal Shards and save Ribbon's planet. They are Waddle Dee, Adelaine, and even King Day-to-Day. Originally there were going to be a number of different playable characters, presumably Kirby and the gang, but in the final game it is only possible to play as Kirby and King Day-to-Day. Waddle Dee and Adelaine play more of a supporting role and show up at different times throughout the game to help Kirby out. Like I said earlier, similarly to how other Kirby games are structured, Kirby 64's story takes place across a number of different planets. These planets or stars range from the classic Pop Star to the infected homeworld of Ribbon Ripple Star. My favorite star was most definitely the ice world Shiver Star. I do have an extreme bias towards anything ice or snow themed in video games, and I'm well aware of that, but I think that even if that wasn't the case, I would still really like Shiver Star. The levels are all really cool, and the boss at the end is one of the best and coolest in the game. There's also a theory that Shiver Star is actually Earth frozen over after some catastrophic event like a nuclear winter. If you look closely at the planet from the selection screen, you can even make out what appears to be the continents. Throughout the levels of Shiver Star, you'll encounter lots of robots and futuristic technology, hinting that this is an Earth from a distant future where only the machines left behind by humans survive. The buildings you'll see are also all very reminiscent of human society, even furthering the frozen Earth theory. Definitely a really neat story to think about, even if it's not confirmed to be true. But enough about how cool Shiver Star is, pun definitely intended. I think it's time we talk about the way you actually play Kirby 64. Like I said in the beginning of the video, Kirby 64 is a 2.5D platformer. But what does that mean? Well, it comes from the fact that the game is rendered in full 3D, but gameplay takes place across solely 2 dimensions, like previous entries in the Kirby series. Back when it first released, Kirby 64 received some flack for not following the trend of other N64 games and going full 3D in terms of gameplay, but that wasn't a problem for me back then, and especially isn't now. If anything, I think this 2.5D approach brought some needed variety to the N64's lineup of mostly 3D games. I can understand why from an early 2000s perspective this could be considered a fault, but in retrospect I'm actually happy the game is a 2D platformer. That's not to say that I wouldn't like to see a 3D Kirby game someday, but I don't think Kirby 64 had to be one. In terms of how the game actually plays, it's very similar to other 2D Kirby games and just 2D platformers in general, in that the goal is to reach the end of the level by traversing a myriad of different obstacles and defeating enemies. Like many of the games in the Kirby franchise that came before and after Kirby 64, Kirby has the ability to walk, run, jump, float, slide kick, and suck up various things like enemies. One of the biggest complaints I had about Kirby's Dream Land 3, a game I reviewed way back last year, was that Kirby had the ability to float upwards for what seemed like an infinite amount of jumps. This made skipping sections of platforming that you didn't want to do extremely easy. But in Kirby 64, the amount of time you can spend in the air and the speed at which you can travel through it has been drastically reduced. This was, in my opinion, one of the best changes this game could have made. You're now pretty much forced to make your way through the level in the intended way, but the verticality of other Kirby games' platforming is still largely intact. Another great addition to the Kirby gameplay formula that Kirby 64 brings to the table is the ability to combine power-ups that you gain by sucking up enemies. You can accomplish this by sucking up 2 enemies at once, or more commonly, take the power-up star you have out and throw it into another enemy. This feature alone made the gameplay of Kirby 64 so much more diverse. I was finding new combinations of power-ups right up until the very end of the game, even though I went for 100% this time around, and I'm honestly not even sure if I saw everything. I absolutely adore the combo power-up system and the variety it brings to gameplay, but there is one problem that I had with it. That is that a decent amount of the combinations are actually worse than the base abilities. A good example of this would be the electric ability. On its own, it makes Kirby nigh invincible with the ability to take out any enemy, but if you combine it with an ice power-up, you instead turn into a fridge that spits out food you can use to heal. The fridge can't move, it just spits out food. This is a clear downgrade that definitely could have been avoided if HAL just tweaked a few things. Like if the fridge could walk and defeat enemies like pretty much every other power-up, it would have been a really great ability, but as it is, it's a combination that I tried to avoid. Now don't get me wrong, there are a lot of really powerful combos, but even those aren't that much stronger than the base abilities. It's by no means a large problem, but it's a problem nonetheless. Another issue that many critics who've reviewed Kirby 64 over the years have brought up is the difficulty level of the game. However, for me personally, I don't think a game needs to be hard to be considered good, let alone fun. If you watched my review of Go-Go Ackman for the Super Famicom, you might remember that I said that that game was an example of a game where the low level of difficulty is a detriment to the experience, but Kirby is one where the mechanics of the game make up for and lend themselves well to the low level of difficulty. And I think that's true of Kirby 64 as well. The game admittedly is very easy, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a ton of fun to play. However, while the low level of difficulty doesn't hamper the experience, I do believe that Kirby 64 could have used some more interesting level design. not necessarily a more difficult design, just some more interesting concepts that could have really put the game over the top. For example, puzzles. I think Kirby 64 could have really benefited from the inclusion of some moderately challenging puzzles. Not so difficult that they aren't solvable by kids, but not so easy that adults will breeze right through them. Maybe something like collecting pieces to a key throughout a level that can be used to progress further when assembled correctly. I'm obviously just spitballing here, and there are definitely other ways to make interesting levels, but I would have at least liked to see HAL try something more out of the ordinary for a Kirby game with 64. But one thing from previous games that I think should have been brought back are the animal friends. You know, Rick and the gang. I know I said Kirby 64's combo system gives the game plenty of variety, but in my opinion it's very hard to have too much variety in a game. It would have been so cool to combine the animal friends with the new combo abilities to form even more interesting and weird combos. And not only that, the addition of the animal friends and their unique abilities would allow for more interesting level design. That's two birds with one stone. Now I know the friends are technically in the game through the use of the cutter and rock combination, but the only time you actually need to use one of their unique abilities is to get a shard that's blocked by a door you can only get through with the rock and cutter combo. Also, they all have had their abilities severely nerfed in this game, not to mention the fact that they can't even change based on the power-up that you have. The only thing that comes close to the animal friends mechanics of previous games are the King Dedede sections where you ride on his back. King Dedede controls completely differently to Kirby, only having a single jump and a hammer swing as his main attack. These sections were honestly a welcome change of pace from the normal Kirby gameplay when they did come up, even if they were a bit slow. I really would have liked to see what HAL had in mind for the rest of the gang's playable sections, but I think that's probably a wish that'll never come true. It's a shame because the Popstar gang could have taken the place of the animal friends and made the gameplay really interesting from level to level. Like many other games in the Kirby series, when you complete a level in Kirby 64, you are greeted with a short minigame where you choose a direction and a distance for Kirby to jump, and based on what you picked, Kirby will land in a different area of the square. There are a number of different items on this square, like food to replenish your health, 1-ups, stars that fill the bar on the bottom of the screen, eventually giving you another life, and even a collectible card that can be viewed from the file select screen and features one of the creatures from Kirby 64. It's an album of all the enemies that shows you what, if any, power-up they give you as well as their name. The big problem with this is that they put the individual cards only in the end of the level minigames, which means if you want to collect them, you pretty much have to go for that every time. Now I know there are people out there that don't really care about collectibles, and will just go for the 1-up or the maximum tomato, but I know that for me, and a lot of other gamers, collectibles are very important. I personally always felt like I had to go for the cards, and that pretty much defeated the purpose of the minigame for me. In my opinion, HAL should have put the cards in the levels of each star as well, so at least then I could have gone for some of the other stuff in the jump minigame if I wanted to. This would also help to alleviate the fact that there are many more cards than there are levels, so you have to play through them multiple times if you want to get all the cards. Luckily they are not required for 100%, but still kind of annoying. Speaking of 100%, let's talk about how you actually get progress in this game. It's pretty simple, just collect Crystal Shards from each level. Each main level has 3 shards, and the boss is 1. The shards in the main levels can be hidden anywhere from high above the scope of the screen to inside a block that requires a specific power-up or power-up combination to break. This collection aspect of Kirby 64 brought necessary difficulty to the game and made going through each individual level much more fun. The shards that require certain power-ups specifically were really fun to get, and the challenge of getting the power-up you needed to the section you needed it in was actually pretty tough sometimes. Of course, this is all optional, but I would definitely recommend going for all the shards if you want a longer and slightly more challenging experience. There's also a true ending that can only be seen if you have all the shards as well, so if you want to experience that, you're going to have to go for 100%. Another aspect of Kirby 64 that I thought brought some welcomed difficulty were the bosses. Now I'm not talking about all the bosses. The earlier bosses like Wispy were of course extremely easy, but as the game goes on you will find yourself fighting harder and harder bosses. The whale boss from Aquastar and the robot boss from Shiverstar come to mind as a few that took me a good number of attempts. Miracle Matter, the boss of Ripple Star, was also very difficult, probably more so than any other boss in the game. You have to hit him with the specific power-up that he is embodying at the time to do damage. The number of different ways that you can fight him and the overall longer length of the fight made it very satisfying in my opinion, and it's probably my favorite Kirby boss fight because of that. However, the last boss you fight after getting 100% is very different. This fight against the ultimate evil, Zero 2, was sadly the easiest boss fight in the game, only taking me a single try. Kirby gains the power of the crystal and the flight of ribbon on his back, which gives him the ability to fight Zero 2, and you just have to shoot his weak points with the crystals in order a few times while dodging very slow-moving projectiles, and that's it. You would think that after completing one of the harder tasks in the game, finding all the crystals, you would be rewarded with an actual harder boss fight, but unfortunately that's not the route HAL decided to go. For what it's worth, it is a pretty cool fight though. But now that we've talked about all of the various gameplay, story, and level design aspects of Kirby 64, let's move on to the more aesthetic elements of the game. First off, we've got to talk about that music. It was composed by a duo of composers, namely Ishikawa Jun and Ando Hirokazu. Like I said in the intro to the video, I only ever rented Kirby 64 as a kid, but even so, the music stuck with me all these years. I have to say, this is probably one of my absolute favorite soundtracks of all time, and I think it deserves that title 100%. The music of Kirby 64 is just so good. A lot of it is remixes and remasters of old Kirby songs, but I don't think that should be considered a bad thing in this case. The upgraded sound capabilities provided by the N64 allowed for much more realistic music, and I think that alone validates the choice to go with old songs. Not to mention the fact that every single song on the soundtrack is super catchy and fits the theme of the individual levels and the Kirby series as a whole extremely well. And I think that comes down to the experience of the two men helming the composition. Both Ishikawa and Ando had worked on the Kirby series extensively leading up to Kirby 64, and continue to do so to this day. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that they are at the core of what makes Kirby music distinctly Kirby, and that most definitely has shown through in 64 as well. I seriously can't compliment this soundtrack enough, and I'd even go as far to say it's worth playing the game just for the music, even if you're not interested in Kirby as a game. It's just that good. With so many of the songs, when they would start playing, I would think, oh yes, it's this one, I love this one. Just an overall really great, fun, and memorable soundtrack that definitely remains a highlight of the game for me. Next up, we've got the visuals, and once again, I've got nothing but praise for HAL. The picture book-like aesthetic they chose to go with makes everything look really cute and fun, and just a joy to look at. I also think this art style has helped the game age very well. In my experience, I wasn't really ever thinking about the fact that I was playing an older game. I was more so just enjoying how colorful and great everything looks as I was walking through the levels. That's seriously something to be proud of in my opinion, so huge props to the visual designers. Another thing that made the visuals even more great in my opinion was the variation in the theme of each level. Not only does each world have a theme like snow or rock, but each individual level has its own theme as well. For example, on Shiverstar there's snow levels, building levels, sky levels, and more. They all follow the general theme of snow and ice, but they each have their own individual identity, which I love. HAL absolutely nailed the aesthetic aspects of this game in my opinion. The last thing we have to talk about here are the 3 multiplayer minigames you can play from the file select screen. You can play with up to 4 people or with CPUs. They're all pretty basic minigames, but I'd bet they'd be a lot of fun if you could get a buddy or two to play with. My favorite is probably the fruit collecting game that's a lot like the Chansey game from Pokemon Stadium 2. Kirby 64 definitely doesn't have the deepest selection of minigames, why would it, but it's still better than nothing for sure. Kirby 64, based on what I've seen, is a game that has kind of fallen into obscurity for a lot of people as the years have gone by. But in my opinion, it remains one of the best and most fun experiences to come out of the franchise. The interesting and varied combo mechanic, the absolutely phenomenal music and art, and the challenging bosses are great examples of what this game does right. But of course, it's not a perfect experience. The levels could use some more interesting concepts, the last boss is way too easy, and the jumping minigame was pretty pointless for me. But overall, I'd say my experience with Kirby 64 was a fun one, that I would recommend you give a try if you haven't already. It's a relatively short game that took me about 5 or 6 hours to 100%, so it's not really that big of a time investment either. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the review. Based on how long this script is, it's probably going to be on the longer side, so thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. If you liked what you saw and heard here today, consider giving the video a like, it's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. Oh yeah, at the end of the game they do the Star Wars ceremony and Kirby gets kissed on the cheek. And he makes a face like, Uchi mama!